The Cold War, the Bomb, and American Manhood. This is the Virtual Jewel Box, the podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah. In this episode, two University of Utah scholars, Matt Basso and Megan Weiss, discuss Dr. Strangelove and the Cold War psyche. Their conversation is in anticipation of a screening of the London National Theatre's production of Dr. Strangelove, starring Steve Coogan, in Salt Lake City. You can find out more about the Tanner Humanities Center's screenings of National Theatre productions on our website, tanner.utah.edu. Here are Matt and Megan.
So this is Matt Basso. I'm a historian with the University of Utah History Department, but I'm also joint appointed in Gender Studies. And I am super excited to talk to Megan Weiss. Megan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. My name is Megan. I am a PhD candidate here at the University of Utah. I'm getting my degree in U.S. history. My research focuses mostly on 20th century gender and Mormonism and public memory, public history. So I'm super excited to be here to talk about the Cold War in Utah.
I am so excited. Megan knows, and now the rest of you will too, that I love Dr. Strangelove. And I'm going to say why here in a second. But the exciting thing is when I asked Megan if she wanted to join me on this podcast, she said, yes, absolutely, because you love Dr. Strangelove too. What is your connection to it?
So for those at home listening, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is based on a 1958 novel by Peter George called Red Alert. But in the movie, the basic premise that you need to know is that there is a rogue general who decides to enact Plan R, which kind of tricks his Air Force flight buddies into dropping atomic bombs on the Soviet Union without the authority of the president. This comes to the president, and it's a huge surprise. Meanwhile, the general shuts off his own army base and tries to carry out the plan. Shenanigans ensue as the U.S. finds itself in a position of trying to stop atomic warfare. So back when I was an undergrad student, also in history, I was kind of like a teaching assistant for one of my committee members. Shout out to Fintan Hoey at Franklin University. Fintan taught this class on the atomic bomb, and it was for first-year students, so it was kind of a way to orient freshmen, but it was also a deep dive into all things atomic bomb. So we watched a really amazing anime called Barefoot Gen that was a depiction of Hiroshima, which was incredible. But the other movie that we watched was Dr. Strangelove, and it is truly, it's iconic. I mean, people say it's like one of the greatest American films of all time, especially in terms of comedy and satire. And yeah, it's kind of a work of genius, but something that I didn't realize before I was preparing to come on this podcast is I didn't realize it was made in the 60s. I thought for sure it would be like 1970s.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Let me give you the exact year. It is a movie from 1964.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I'm sure we'll get into this, but it really is a primary source from the Cold War about the Cold War.
I completely agree.
I'm just super excited to talk about it. I find the Cold War very interesting. I find the impact of the atomic bomb on like American culture and the American psyche fascinating.
Yeah.
Our world has not been the same since.
This is exciting. So I will say that we're going to talk about all of that stuff, which I'm
yeah, that was a good
super
intro.
thrilled to do. And we can talk about the peculiar ways, the detailed ways that this film sheds light on American culture, on American society in the 60s, which is, I think, a pretty surprising space when you think of this film as coming from within it. I fell in love with Dr. Strangelove for a very specific reason, and this is my shout out. My dad loved this film. So he absolutely loved Peter Sellers. He loved Slim Pickens. He just loved the vibe of this film. He thought it was very, very funny. Most folks that are listening to this podcast will know just a little bit about the context of this film, and we're going to talk more deeply about it. But as noted, it's really intriguing that this is a pretty in-your-face condemnation of really the military-industrial complex and a governmental culture that
The Red Scare.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it felt real to people still in 1964, which we can talk about in more detail. For those that don't know, the Cold War really emerges almost immediately after World War II. As Megan already noted, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are kind of a spark point for this
Yeah.
already emerging contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. The bomb escalates that, and then various other tensions escalated even further till by 1947, 1948, we're fully into a Cold War. And when Russia gets the bomb themselves, then all things are off. The Cold War ends in 1989 with the falling of the wall, so to speak. Gorbachev, exactly.
Yeah. Shout out to Gorbachev.
Yeah. And this guy named Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Right.
But the culture of it is so with us
Yes,
today.
yes.
I mean, Cold War culture is bleeding into like everything, even like contemporary Utah politics. And I'm going to start to say something spicy. So, but something that's really interesting about contemporary Utah is just last week, the Utah State Board of Education talked about this policy change around DEI. And they talked about DEI as Bolshevism.
Mm-hmm.
And they talked about the Bolshevik agenda and the Soviet agenda infiltrating American schools. All these fears of like fluoride are very reflective of Jack Ripper's fears of fluoride in the movie. So the culture of the Red Scare period was really defining of the new right, of contemporary Utah in my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much still with us, even though, 1989, the wall fell. We're still kind of seeped in the impact of it.
I think that's right. And at even a larger scale, I think for folks of my age and older, and maybe you'll say the same thing for your generation, it is striking and challenging to see Russia as anything other than our Cold War enemy.
Mm-hmm.
So this massive geopolitical shift that we're in the midst of right now, it's hard to not experience it with the Cold War frame
in mind.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
incredible. And yet the emergence of the Cold War was not a given, right? So we can go back and talk a little bit of history here, and then we can talk about why this film is such a striking satire and how we got to that point, right? So Cold War emerges, as we've already noted, just after World War II, but the Soviet Union, Russia, they're allies of ours during World War II, right? There's always this long-running Red Scare and that anti-communist, almost religion, while kind of a little bit under the surface during World War II, emerges again incredibly powerfully with the beginning of the Red Scare. The dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, do you remember reading about the response by Americans to the dropping of these bombs?
Yeah, one of the most formative books about this, in my opinion, is actually Watchmen, the comic. It talks pretty extensively about the debate at the time around whether we should have done it or not.
Yeah.
And it was controversial at the time. America was pretty, correct me if I'm wrong, I was pretty 50-50 split on if it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. But a lot of people argued that it was kind of inevitable. Obviously, nothing in history is inevitable.
Right. And so the argument goes that we dropped the bomb and to end the war more quickly, right? Folks.
It's a sacrifice, a necessary sacrifice.
A necessary sacrifice, and it's going to save our soldiers. Mm-hmm. Other folks disagree and say it was a way of flexing this new technology that we had, this world-changing technology, these bombs, and making sure that we were set up to be the dominant power right during the early Cold War. But you're exactly right. The response to the bomb itself on the home front is kind of astonishing.
Yeah.
So Truman famously tells a ship full of Navy folks about this, and they all applaud because of that sense that this might end the war sooner.
It was a symbol of peace. Yeah.
In theory, right? And then, of course, there's really a pretty strong anti-Japanese sentiment because of the Pacific War being so much more painful, so much more violent and egregious in many ways, supposedly. Now, if you look at actual newspapers from just after when the bomb was dropped, you see exactly what you're saying, which is a mix of opinions. Some folks celebrated this across the country, some communities. Other communities were deeply, deeply worried, right? This felt like the genie was out of the bottle. It felt like we could end the world. Religious figures were especially almost struck silent by this sense of dread that perhaps we had finally started the process of doing ourselves in as humans and as humanity. And yet, just a couple of years later, we've started the process of domesticating the bomb,
Right.
of making it feel like we can live with the bomb.
Yeah,
Right?
there's all those like science kits that like kids would buy that were like, make your own radium.
This is it, right?
They put radium in like plates and cups.
Yeah. And there's
Yeah.
a sense that, maybe this can bring good things. So
Yeah.
there's advertising of atomic medicine, for example. There's the idea that we might be able to use it in agriculture and of course, energy, so on and so forth, to where this sense of dread and foreboding that you really see in 1946, 1945, which is, I think, perfectly encapsulated this shift in the subtitle of this movie.
How I Learned to Love the Bomb. Yep.
Incredible, right?
It's genius.
It's
Yeah.
genius. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
And it helps folks remember just how worried their ancestors were, right? Fellow Americans were in 1946 about what this meant on all sorts of different levels, but certainly for the future of humanity.
Yeah.
We learned to love the bomb,
Absolutely.
right?
What's really interesting about this period too is obviously like a mixture of factors, like the New Deal, creation of this like very robust administrative state, really strong social security safety net, but also things like the GI Bill that empowered returning soldiers to go to college, get degrees, buy homes very easily, the explosion of the car, the explosion of the suburbs. It created this very affluent, well-educated American society that was falling into this very rigid family structure. One of the best books about this is Homeward Bound by Elaine Tyler May. Love that book, but she talks about how the baby boom was so much, it was such an anomaly. There's this assumption that the like 1950s nuclear family living in the suburbs with like the man who works Mad Men style, the housewife who stays home, that is kind of remembered in the American consciousness today as like the good old days. That's how it's always been. But if you look at family structures from the 1910s, 20s, during the Great Depression, family structures did not look like that. They were not isolated into single homes with one moneymaker and one domestic worker. Family structures were much more sprawling, kind of like multi-generational, and very mixed. It was during the post-World War II era that there was this massive movement amongst young Americans to get married and have kids. That's why it was a baby boom. It was an anomaly, but it was empowered by this like very unique social situation, social economic system in the federal level that was empowering people to do this. But something that's really great about that book, Homeward Bound, is the way that that historian connects what was going on domestically in the culture of housewife culture, the way that it was actually directly tied to this international policy war, atomic war, space war. So there's this really great scene where Khrushchev and what was it? Nixon, I think. They had the kitchen debate.
Yeah, Khrushchev and Nixon's in the kitchen.
Yeah,
Exactly.
so it was like this expo where it's like we're showing off different types of washing machines and dishwashers from our countries. And there was a debate over if the Russian or the American washing machine is better. And that really encapsulates that the Cold War was about the atomic bomb. It was about communism versus capitalism. But it was also about, at home in America, the nuclear family as the ultimate proof that America is superior. And this is something that I've definitely seen in my research, as you know, but I think it does kind of come up in Dr. Strangelove a little bit. Something that is fascinating to me about this movie is that anytime we see a woman, she is in a bikini or naked. So there's like some women in like a locker. There's some pictures of women in bikinis. There's the secretary who's smoking a cigarette in the hotel room in her bikini and heels. And even just the word bikini is a relic from this period where women were starting to wear smaller swimsuits, and they were referred to as the bikini as a reference to atomic testing in the Bikini Islands.
Yeah.
So it's so connected. What was going on with gender, what was going on with women's sexuality and women's appearance. And it was very tied in to these anxieties around, like, is America going to survive these existential threats of atomic warfare, communism, a changing world order? And there was a real reliance on the security and stability that a nuclear patriarchal family represented.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I love that book too.
Yeah.
Elaine was actually one of my advisors in grad school.
I did not know that.
Yeah,
Did I know that? That's so cool.
So,
okay, shout out.
A wonderful scholar. And as you're noting and put so perfectly, one of the things that she argues is that the nuclear family is all about containment, right? And so this is containing all the things you just mentioned, the fear of the bomb, the containment of communism, the containment of women's sexuality, which is shifting dramatically during the World War II years and into the post-war. This, again, domesticates, takes power away from women in many ways, scholars have argued. But there's other factors at play. And again, your perfectly chosen example, the kitchen debate, right?
So funny.
It's capitalism,
yeah.
Right? So you're seeing, as we're talking, all these C's. I kind of tend to teach this era talking about C's, about communism, about containment, about capitalism, right? But another one is consumerism. And so you see that in the kitchen debate, you see this sense that what makes the American ideology capitalism, by that point is what the American ideology is.
Yeah.
Superior is the ability to have stuff, right? Now, what's intriguing is that this film brushes up against the edges of that, as you just noted, but it does appear in a couple of strange places. It doesn't fully center at all this family, but we know that's what's being protected in theory. So for instance, there's wonderful new scholarship on gun capitalism, right? This is a book by Andrew McKevitt, Gun Country. And what he argues is that not only are we buying tons of refrigerators and cars and moving into suburbs and new homes, but we're also buying a ton of guns. These guns, by the way, were excess weapons produced by the US and other allies left in Europe during World War II. Mm-hmm. Sure, we have our own domestic producers, but millions of units of those World War II guns got shipped back to the US. They were inexpensive, they were widely advertised, and they became part of this consumption pattern. If you look, and if listeners look at the film, I don't know if this is going to be in the theater production, behind Jack Ripper's desk is a wall display of a huge number of different guns. And those could be weapons that he purchased. They could be American weapons, but just as likely they're foreign weapons that were purchased as part of this massive gun boom that occurs just after World War II and is part of the militarization of American society.
Yep.
And no
Every
place,
level.
right? Does this happen to a level, everyone thinks maybe the South. Yes, but absolutely the West, right? The West is the absolute cornerstone of a militarization of American society, culture, landscapes. And we see that with the air base, which I think is beautifully named Burpelson.
I know, the names in this story are so funny.
Yeah, it's just incredible. But we are, in fact, right? We are the launching pad for all sorts of defensive atomic, or we think defensive, we hope defensive atomic weapons. This movie puts that into question, right?
Yeah.
It puts the idea of America only using these weapons as a defensive measure. It puts that into question, and they launch, we think, or so it looks, from someplace in the northern Great Plains, where a lot of these bases were, Montana, the Dakotas, etc. Did you see in your own research about Utah signs of that kind of militarization, the militarization of American society and culture?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that what's really unique about Utah, and our colleague John Flynn researches this a lot in his work on Dugway. Utah is part of the Great Basin ecosystem, which is where water pools and collects and dissolves into the ground and makes things like salt lakes that aren't very useful because they're so salty, you can't irrigate with them. So there's this idea that Utah, like the Nevada desert, where they did so much atomic testing, is kind of a wasteland where you can just kind of do whatever you want to the land. And, we have Air Force bases out here, but we also do crazy tests out at Dugway even today because of this idea that the Great Basin is fundamentally unusable. It's not farmland. So what can we do there? It's kind of a militarization of the landscape itself, which is crazy. My research is more into the world of heritage, archives, public memory. My dissertation is about this really incredible women's heritage organization called the Daughters of Utah Pioneers. And during the 1950s and 60s, there was a very strong desire within the DUP, but also within places like the Historical Society, the LDS Church Archives, to protect and preserve history physically. So the LDS Church built a vault up Little Cottonwood Canyon in the side of a mountain. It's still there today. I don't know if you can go visit anymore, but you used to be able to go visit it. And this vault has thousands of archival records inside of it, but it's also built with this arched corrugated steel design. So it's very much like a fallout shelter. And that was kind of the thinking at the time, was we need to put our records into this vault to protect it in case of a, atomic air raid. Same for the Daughters of Utah Pioneers. They famously built their Pioneer Memorial Museum, which is kind of like Utah's de facto state museum. They built that in 1950. And it was thought of as kind of this vault for pioneer relics. At the dedication, there was this prayer by Ezra Taft Benson, who is a really interesting Cold War Utah history figure. And he talked about protect what's in these walls from the evil forces of the world. And evil forces in this case are certainly atomic warfare, but it's also existential evil forces like communism. So this is peak Red Scare rhetoric. And with the Red Scare, as well as the Lavender Scare, there's this idea that there are certain types of people who will take our history and do something bad with it. And we can't trust them. So for the Daughters of Utah Pioneers, under the leadership of Kate Carter, who's a woman historian, they kind of made everything restricted. They didn't let anybody access their archive unless they were a member of the organization. They didn't let anybody come to their board meetings or read any of their minutes. And this just shows how widespread this mentality was of, we need to lock down, we need to contain, we need to watch our backs. It was a real culture of fear. And that's what makes this movie so remarkable, that it came out in the 1960s and it is just throwing that out the window and satirizing everything.
Yeah. It's calling it to task, right? It's really...
Definitely.
And, that sensibility about both fear and security, it gets manifested in this film in really remarkably interesting ways to me, I think. So, for instance, there's this sense of technical know-how in this movie that surprises me every time I watch it. I'll be curious to see if the theater production tries to replicate this, but it's about... For us, maybe as watchers today, it feels like dated technology. But I will say that I was struck again by not just what they satirize in this movie, but what they don't satirize, which tells us as much about that society as anything else. And one of the things they don't satirize really is technical know-how. Sure, it's not foolproof, right? As we see, there's ways around it, but the ability of these technologies to communicate over great distances. These planes are flying all over the world, and they're launched all the time. The inside of the plane, this is the B-52, which is a ancestor, I guess, right? It's a follow-on predecessor, but it's the bomber that comes after World War II bombers. Most Americans have seen World War II bombers now on film, like Masters of the Air and things like that, and they just look rickety. And those air crews are just like, wow, I can't believe they're doing that. The B-52 looks like a flying technological lab. It looks almost more like a silo than it does anything other than that. And it's impressive, this flight crew, their ability to run all of this machinery, what feels like high tech. And then back at Burpelson, the computer banks and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot being satirized, but I'm not entirely sure that the technology of the era, which many Americans felt made the U.S. supreme, is being satirized. It's really pretty impressive.
And it makes the film even more realistic and terrifying and believable.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to be cutting back to those scenes in the cockpit or in the plane where they're just soldiers doing a job. And there's not really any unpacking or interpretation of the fact that they're going to, kill a bunch of people or maybe trigger a nuclear winter across the globe. That is not even really on their minds. It's just like one of my favorite parts is when Slim Pickens goes to the vault and gets out his cowboy hat. Yeah. He's like, all right, it's go time. And that's really the only thing that changes in the soldiers, because at the end of the day, they're just following orders.
That's right. They're technocrats in many ways and extraordinarily effective. The ideologues are in the war room, right? And they're back at Burpelson with Jack Ripper, right? But the soldiers themselves, all the way up to Slim Pickens, they suggest an extraordinarily effective U.S. military, something that is going to change, of course, in Americans' attitudes with the Vietnam War, right? There's a real question about that, but it shows that the dramatic victories of World War II and even the problems of Korea don't dampen the sense that American armed forces, and especially the most technical aspects of the armed forces, like the Air Force, are superior, and that they represent what this nation now stands for, which is kind of a marriage between technology, corporate possibilities, a government that is on the security and containment footing. It's just quite remarkable. And a government, as you noted earlier, which still has some New Deal aspects to it, right? This
very
is
robust.
64. Yeah, right? I mean, this is just when JFK. In fact, I think one of the problems with the film release is that it was scheduled to be released very similar moment to when JFK was assassinated.
Right. Yeah, I saw that.
And they had to push back a little bit and try and take some lines out of the film. But to give listeners a sense of exactly when this is that moment. And it is both a wartime moment, a militarized moment, but also still a New Deal moment and a social safety net moment, and a moment, as you already alluded to, where ordinary Americans feel the best off they've felt maybe ever. Right. This is the place in our history where people feel the most affluent, where the income gap and the wealth gap is the least between the really wealthy and regular folks. It's something else. It's kind of this incredible context. And here comes this film, right, satirizing a lot of this stuff. I wanted to ask you who your favorite character is, because I've got an answer for myself, but I'm wondering what you're thinking.
I do love everyone that Peter Sellers plays, especially Dr. Strangelove. But I'm trying to remember the name of the British guy, the Muff Meeker or something.
Oh no, that's the president, right? That's Merkin Muffley.
That's right. That's right. I'm thinking of the British guy.
Of Group Captain Mandrake.
Mandrake.
Yes.
I really like Mandrake, and I think that if there's any evidence of the lavender scare in this film, I think I see Mandrake as a little bit. He's the butt of the joke in a lot of scenes because of his Britishness and his desire to do things the right way and like keep Jack Ripper in line, but still be really, really polite and not too macho. He's kind of the antithesis of this like American gun holding officer that Jack Ripper is. But I also feel like in being British and kind of like coded as like weak and frail, I think he's like a bit of a dandy character, which I find fascinating. That's just my interpretation of that character.
I love that.
For those listening, the Lavender Scare was kind of a parallel movement to the Red Scare that was more focused on queer government workers and purging the government, but also film, really any industry of any gay or lesbian or queer people. But yeah, Mandrake is fascinating. I don't know. It's hard to pick a favorite character.
Like that. So I've got to say that we share a passion for Mandrake.
Okay.
So I'm a big fan too. And I like your Lavender Scare reading, especially, there's new scholarship now about the Lavender Scare that really argues this, of course, incredibly important moment. It's in some ways sequestered to the public sector, and that the private sector, queer folks were still able to kind of figure out ways of maintaining their workplace, but that their positions in workplaces, but they were always kind of on the edge, right? They were precarious, which is an interesting vibe for the Cold War in general, where stability is so important and where so many people did have stability in work. This precarity feels like it runs just as an undercurrent throughout American society because of the bomb, right? And because of this Cold War. The part that I love about Mandrake, these poor listeners are going to have to hear us talk about Mandrake, who's our, one of my favorites, is an exchange with Jack Ripper, who, as you noted, is this macho, gun-wielding, classic American command figure.
I mean, his name's Jack Ripper.
Right, Jack Ripper.
Pretty on.
Right, and he only drinks rainwater and
right. No fluoride.
Whiskey. Yeah, no fluoride for him. But he's asked by Ripper, basically, Mandrake, have you ever seen combat? Have you ever seen action? And Mandrake says, Jack, yes, I have. And it turns out he was tortured, right? And this is this moment to me where you see kind of the reality of kind of a quiet masculinity versus the loud, brash masculinity of someone like Ripper, who seems to be hot air, right, in part, and seems extraordinarily, ultimately unsure of himself, certainly we would say unbalanced. And then, of course, we know what happens to Jack Ripper. And here's Mandrake, a British figure who's trying to keep it all together, right? It's a movie that's filmed in England, right? It's a movie that has a lot of British folks in the cast. It makes you wonder about what the global perception was of American cold warriors and this kind of brash masculinity that seems to dominate both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Remember, JFK, Bay of Pigs, right? This face-off, and then this move into Vietnam and Green Berets initially, which JFK championed. And then LBJ, of course, takes that baton and keeps on building in Vietnam. There's reasons to suspect that other parts of the globe really wondered about this militarized American presence and what it was going to mean for the safety.
How stable
planet.
It is.
Yeah. But it turns out that as part of this satire, right, part of this plan, there is a potential solution, right? Things go wrong. A bomber does get through, the most famous scene of the entire movie.
Yes.
Which is obviously a cowboy riding his bull right down into a Soviet air base,
Yeehaw.
CPM base. But a lot of folks, I think, that maybe don't know this movie might believe that it ends at that point. It feels like an ending.
Yeah.
What did you think about what happens afterwards?
Well, a couple of things. Apparently, the original ending of the movie was a pie fight in the war room.
Yes.
Which is fascinating. I do think that would have completely changed the tone of the film. So I support the move to take it out. The ending is nuclear winter because of the doomsday device that the Soviets have that activates and makes the entire planet uninhabitable. So there is this idea from Dr. Strangelove and all the men in the war room to restart humanity by going down into a bunker.
And in that bunker, we learn that there's details that very much speak to the bikini-clad secretary, that speak to this kind of sexualization.
10 women for one man.
10 women for one man, right? Yeah. This sense that we've restored the proper order of things by making women just sexualized beings again, right? Instead of what was happening during World War II or as equals to men. This film is chock full of really pretty egregious gender politics, which are being satirized,
Yes.
and yet they also kind of
They
reinforce,
kind of come up.
right, the sensibility.
And Dr. Strangelove, the Nazi turned war consultant in the
Yes.
war room. He's a complicated character because I think like the portrayal is like a little ableist, where he's like in this wheelchair, but he gets so excited about this bunker humanity restart plan that he can walk again.
Yes.
And he is the biggest proponent of it, which makes sense for that kind of ideology. But yeah, I don't know. The ending is crazy.
I'll say that I struggle a little bit. I was saying that Mandrake is my favorite, but next favorite is General Buck Turgidson. What a name, as you noted, right? George C. Scott, who is, I think, just pitch perfect in this film. And in the war room, he's in the middle of, hilariously, after we initially see him, in a motel room with his bikini-clad secretary, he's in the middle of offering a prayer, right? So this kind of critique or commentary about Americans' sense of religion and how that mixes with their politics and their Cold War politics. And then he gets excited about this plan, right? And then they start kind of wargaming it out.
Yeah.
And in one of the other great
He's like,
lines
this
of
is
this film,
perfect. Now we can bomb the Russians. Let's do it.
but they start to worry about, and this is another famous part of the movie, about a mine shaft gap, right? What if the Soviets get more mine shafts full of a 10-to-1 ratio of men and women, 10 women to every single man. And again, it's this very much send-off of this mindset, right? Of this Cold War mindset at a moment in 1964 when already there was certainly enough atomic weapons to eliminate the globe, right? I mean, and this was part of the arms race, right? Hydrogen bombs at that point, and this constant vigilance. We know that détente lasts, besides the kind of wars like Vietnam, Latin America, conflicts in Africa, but the big war doesn't happen. And yet in 1964, they don't know that, right? There is this kind of profound concern. They're in the thick of it. And I think it's a great reminder of a conformist America where there still are voices that are speaking up. There are still, I think America in this, early 60s, 50s was just conformist. No, there was folks that were critiquing the military-industrial complex,
People like Stanley Kubrick.
People like Stanley Kubrick, right? And incredibly, very public figures like General Eisenhower. At that point, President Eisenhower, who spoke about the military-industrial complex. So it's a much more interesting, complicated age, I think, than some people give it credit for. And this film, I think, perfectly encapsulates that complexity.
I agree.
And all the strangeness of atomic America.
Absolutely agree. Very well said.
Thank you, Megan. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, this
chatting
was great.
with you about Cold War and learning more about your research.
Thank you so much for having me for chatting. This is great.
I'm very excited to keep on learning more about the DUP, about Cold War and other Utah, because as always, just like with the Cold War of Dr. Strangelove, you're finding a much more complicated story.
Absolutely.
Right? It's exciting.
It's always more complicated.
Always more complicated. All right. Thanks to the Tanner Humanities Center for having us on. And we hope that lots of folks that have listened to the podcast both watch the movie and especially go see the National Theater Live presentation of Dr. Strangelove.
This has been the Virtual Jewel Box. Named after our seminar room, the Virtual Jewel Box hosts conversations at the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah. You can find out more about the center's programming, including film screenings, at tanner.utah.edu. Thank you for listening, and here's Jelly Roll Morton's Perfect Rag.